to the Stanford MBA two-generational wisdom bridge across 30 years. I'm your host, Catherine Keogh McLennan from the MBA class of 1995 of Stanford. In each episode, I bring together one of my classmates, now in our 60s, give or take, and a member of the class of 2025, now in their 30s, give or take, and about to graduate into an entirely different world than we graduated in 1995. Back then, we finished our MBAs just as the internet was emerging. Today's grads are stepping into a future shaped by artificial intelligence, uncertainty, and we hope that we express possibility. These conversations bridge generations, share lessons, and spark reflections on leadership, life, and what's next. Let's dive in. Today, I'm joined by Russell Eggers, a seasoned executive from the Stanford MBA class of 1995, and a dear friend of mine who lives close in Sydney, Australia. Now a CEO and board director, Russell brings over 40 years of operational leadership across mining, aviation, and industrial enterprises. He's known for turning strategy into growth in the old school businesses and for speaking candidly about the power of humility, hiring well, and staying grounded in the real economy. Joining him is Michael Liu, who's a second-year MBA student from the class of 2025. Born in China, raised in Sydney, and soon to be based in New York, Michael brings a global perspective on finance, from investment banking at Goldman Sachs to private equity at Warburg Pincus to public equity investing at Rowe Price. At Stanford, he held multiple leadership roles and is deeply interested in AI, economics, and equity market dynamics. Together, Russell and Michael explore what it means to lead across generations, industries, and ideologies, from manufacturing floors to Wall Street trading desks.
Thanks for having me. I'm also from Australia, so we've got two people that live in Australia and one person from Australia.
Yeah, all of us are from Australia, honestly. Russell and I have been here for like over 30 years, I would say. Yeah.
I left in 93 to go to Stanford and never went back to New Zealand.
Yeah, well, that's a good place to start. What is New Zealand versus Australia? What's the reason, Russell, that you've...
I'm a very proud Kiwi. There's no two ways about that.
Absolutely.
But I'm also Australian now. Look, for me coming out of Stanford, I was always intending to go back to New Zealand and work in the industry that I came out of, but life just happens along the way and opportunities arose, and I've been very happy. I love Australia and I've been very happy living here and the opportunities it's given me, and it's also taken me to other parts of the world through those opportunities, and it's only 3 hours from New Zealand, so I could get back and see my family and see my friends and all that sort of thing. So it's a great place to live, and I'm not allowed to say that as a Kiwi. I'll have to hand my passport back soon, but it's a great place to live.
Don't worry, we're going to make you the sixth state. Michael, tell me about how you're Australian. Where have you grown up?
Well, it's funny. I was born in China and my parents immigrated to New Zealand first. So I'm actually a New Zealand citizen as well.
There you go.
And then we moved as a family to Sydney when I was young, and I grew up there. So I spent all my education there and then went to University of New South Wales in Sydney, and then got the travel bug and wanted to see the world. So I left and started working in Asia. I did a couple of years in finance, and then now I'm at the GSB. There's about 5 of us in the Australia-New Zealand club. So we're small, but we punch much above our weight.
Of course you do. Of course you do. Russell and I had the Australian-New Zealand club, and we had a few people. Russell, do you remember that one?
I think we started it when we found out Bob Hawke was coming to visit. So we go, we better just make a club so that we can give an invite to Bob and come and speak to us, which was an interesting occasion in its own.
Wasn't it fantastic? And and for those people that don't know, it's one of our legendary prime ministers that I think was in office in the late 1980s. Is that right, Russell? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. So. And wasn't it an honor to talk to the prime minister, who was a Rhodes Scholar, and just incredible to hear his stories. I mean, that's like kind of talking to one of our presidents, but maybe not as prestigious. I don't know. Fantastic.
It was interesting, and what I found for me coming from New Zealand, because New Zealand's slightly more reserved than Australia, having Bob Hawke sit there, and I asked a question about our New Zealand Prime Minister at the time, and Bob just said, "Oh, he's an idiot." The Americans in the room, he used slightly more colourful language than that, but the Americans in the room were aghast that a prime minister was talking about a recent, prime minister of another country in those terms. But that
I know.
was Bob Hawke. He was just a man of the people, and he called it as he saw it.
Well, the Americans have indicated they've changed a bit in their language. So, and I won't get into politics other than some general insights because I don't want to be left or right. That's just an indication. So, Michael, how did you end up at the GSB? Why did you go there? And what did you do in between you finished at University of New South Wales?
Yeah, so I finished at UNSW, went into finance. I worked for Goldman Sachs for a couple of years in
In
Hong
Sydney?
Kong.
Hong
Hong Kong,
Kong.
in
That's
Hong Kong.
okay. Fantastic.
So I loved it, worked really hard. And then during COVID, I moved back to Australia.
Okay.
So I spent a
Okay.
couple of years in Sydney at Crescent Capital Partners, which is a private equity fund.
Okay.
And I really enjoyed that. And at the time, there weren't a lot of Australians that study abroad or go do an MBA. It's not really a big thing in Australia. And so I had a couple of friends that were at other funds and they had a kind of a business school program and they were kind of applying for business school. And one of my partners at the fund that I was working at said that she had applied back in the day and decided not to go, but regretted it. And I just thought it sounded incredible, like 2 years to kind of spend time in the US, see the world. And so it was really her influence that encouraged me to apply. And as I've got further along the application process, I kind of convinced myself that it was more and more so what I wanted to do. I think I got connected with people in the Australia New Zealand Club at the time, and then I
Ah,
started to speak
fantastic.
more to alumni. And it just seemed like a really different experience from my Australian undergrad where I kind of lived at home and I was kind of working all the time and wasn't on campus. It's just a completely different experience. And here it was everyone sees each other, you're a really tight-knit community and you kind of hold that alumni ship with you for the rest of your careers. And so that was something I wanted to be a part of. And plus I'd never spent time in the US before, so that's why I'm
Well,
here.
were you in the good place? There's so many things there, Michael. My gosh. The universities in Australia, and I don't know, Russell, in New Zealand, are so different from the American universities in regards to that, Michael. And, it really shows in the alumni, Russell, for the rest of our 30 years. That doesn't sound good. For the last 30 years. I mean, some of us are so close and, I know Russell so well through all kinds of things and New Zealand, but we all keep up, don't we, Russell?
Yeah, yeah. Look, the thing I found out of university versus Stanford, and I make a very clear distinction between that, is that, I have a couple of friends from university because I went as an adult student into my undergrad as well. So, and then, the contacts I have at Stanford are much more open, much more contactable, and you catch up once every 5 years or 10 years even, and it's sort of like just opening the door as though you just left the apartment yesterday, and you walk into the bar and it's all there. Everybody's very, very, I've found, very happy to share.
Yeah, they sure are. The other thing that I noticed, Michael, in a lot of your classmates in 2025, you kind of said it was a great chance to be international. You guys are traveling all the time during your 2 years. What's your story? Where have you gone?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this year, so the year below me, 2026, is the most international class ever. So I
Is that
think it's
right?
38 or 39% international, which
No
is
Right on.
way.
incredible.
Fantastic.
And I think
Fantastic.
because we are a class that has happened after COVID, a lot of us have tried to capitalize on the missed 2 years of travel. So we've almost over indexed on traveling. And so I went to Croatia for Yacht Week prior to school. I didn't go to Colombia, but I went to Morocco right afterwards. And then I've been all over Europe. I've got friends that are I've gone to Japan over spring break. I've got friends going to Africa. Everyone is traveling a lot. And I think it's a function of the fact that we had 3 years that we couldn't travel because of COVID. And so now we're, yeah, going overboard within that respect.
And you guys also do a lot of study abroad. I mean, not study abroad, but the projects you do during business school. Some of you guys did go to China, I believe, and
Yes.
some of the others. What projects have you done? Or
So it's called a GST, a global study trip. So I did
okay,
Morocco
oh,
with
that's
30
Morocco.
of my
Okay,
classmates right before school. It was the best experience. My best friends at the GSV I met on that trip. I've got friends that went to Australia, New Zealand. They went to the UK where they met Rishi Sunak. They went to Japan. They went to Taiwan, Korea. And then a couple of them did a STEP exchange program, which is the Stanford Tsinghua exchange program with Tsinghua University in China. And so they would go there during Thanksgiving break, and then they would host Tsinghua University students
awesome.
in January. And so it's kind of this two-way exchange. So there's a lot of these things happening.
Yeah, good. Private equity is interesting, Russell, and you might be able to help me. In Australia, when we came back, it was, I shouldn't say just forming, but it wasn't the most popular thing. I don't know, Russell, you can overcorrect me. The consultants of us, the management consultants, watched some of our colleagues go into private equity in Australia and set up, and 30 years later, they've done very well. So, but Russell, you've been involved a little bit in the private equity in Australia. How have you experienced it? Because you've had some really interesting placements through families and private equity. It'd be interesting to hear.
Yeah, look, I think when it started out, I think because one of our colleagues from Booz Allen at the time started up one of the first firms, and it was just an unknown. I mean, there wasn't a concept of it. In fact, I don't really even know how sort of you floated a business idea other than through regular bank or
Didn't
family funding. At the
you didn't?
time, for small business anyway. Large
Yeah,
business was slightly different. There just wasn't a space in the market. The likes of Archer Capital and people like that, they started out very small, and they were a small business growing
they
in
sure
a
were.
different business model. So I haven't spoken to any of the principals there about how they found it when they were starting up, but I imagine it would have been very difficult because even coming back in 95, Australia was a relatively conservative, not necessarily out there business environment. It was run by the big banks and the big mining companies, and it was sort of quite conservative in its approach. Consequently, every man and their dog is trying to do it. The firms that I got involved with were they were looking for operational backgrounds, and the private equity versus venture capital is two very different things. And one of the
Absolutely.
firms I worked for, the principals, they talked the same, used the same words, but meant entirely different things, which caused an awful lot of conflict in the.
Tell us the difference, Russell, because I'd be interesting to talk to Michael and his current perspective of 2020's private equity. But what were the differences that you saw?
So look, I'm not involved in VC. Haven't been involved in VC, but my perception of VC is, you have a large portfolio of opportunities and you fund them all.
Yeah.
One of them is going to be a unicorn, and it covers. It's just a classic
There's
portfolio
lots of
theory. Whereas private equity, you're investing in typically in operating businesses, sometimes an idea, but typically in operating businesses. And coming out of old industries and corporate, I actually found it quite hard because even though they're investing in businesses and wanting them to grow, it's focused on the finances, and it's
absolutely,
focused on the multiples.
absolutely.
The last meeting you have when you actually get the deal across the line and you've bought the business, the next meeting is how do we get rid of this?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
how do we get rid of this at a multiple? Whereas for me, working in operations and being in a corporate, the timeline is much longer around strategy. It could be a 5-year, it could be a 10-year timeline with a very clear goal. And you recognize that over those 10 years, there are going to be different people driving the program all the way
Absolutely.
through, and you'll have a small part to play, but it's a part in a story that you can sort of see the end of, and sometimes you get there, sometimes you
I
don't.
got to come back to that because I think some of the things that you did, especially when you left in Dyno Nobel, were so fascinating. But Michael, give us a perspective, I guess, of Australia, but Goldman Sachs is a little different in terms of investment banking up in Hong Kong. But private equity, what have you experienced, and is that something you want to continue to do?
Yeah, well, it's a very mature landscape now. I think there's
It
a
is.
lot more foreign, we call limited partners, who are the people that invest in these funds coming into Australia. They like the governance structure. They like that it's, a more mature market. And they like the kind of population growth that's happening in Australia. So I think there's a lot of kind of structural tailwinds that are really helping the industry. And so in the past, I would say maybe 15 to 20 years, there's been a really big inflow in terms of LP capital, as well as new funds that have started up. And at the same time, there's been a lot of global funds that have entered the market as well.
Sure has.
So
Yeah,
like we
that's
call
right.
them mega funds, or we, have kind of sovereign wealth funds that are opening an office, and it's becoming an increasingly important part of an Asia portfolio because it's interesting. Oceania sits as part of Asia, but it's really quite a mature westernized market. And so it kind of is a little less risky than kind of entering a full emerging market. So I really enjoyed it. I think it taught me a lot about how to operate businesses, business acumen, and how to kind of think about things in an analytical way. And so I'm taking those skill sets and distilling what I liked about the job. And so I'm actually moving on to public equities, which is kind of still an investing role, but I would say the feedback loop is a little quicker. There's less focus on the operations, more focused on kind of the analysis. And so that's just my kind of personal preference and what I've distilled from my time in finance. But
I don't even know
really enjoyed it.
what public equity means. Tell
So
us in a nutshell.
basically buying and selling stocks.
Okay.
Basically
Okay.
a stock picker. There's hedge
Okay.
funds and mutual funds, but the whole bucket is public equity. So you're investing in public companies. The skill set is very similar, but the feedback loop is a lot shorter. So you kind of know if you've made the right decision quite quickly compared to in private equity where it takes, a long time to know if your investment's going to...
Of course you do. So could you be part of a bank to do that? Because I know the equities in many banks, often play in the markets.
Yeah, I'll be joining a mutual fund, which kind of
Okay.
invests a lot of 401k money or retirement money. You could also join a hedge fund, which is a kind of a different structure, but they have different kind of incentive structure. But the essential job is the same.
So you're staying in the United States?
I am staying in the United States. I'm moving to New York.
How could you do that?
After graduation, I haven't had enough of the US yet. I really enjoyed it here, so I want to spend a bit more time here. But I will visit Australia a lot.
Well, I hope so. You got to visit us. And New York is a country on its own anyway. So, but Russell, you went to the US, didn't you, after Stanford? I was trying to remember.
Look, I am a little bit of an Americaphile in terms of, because I did an exchange year at high school in the US, and I loved it. I had a great old time, and it was in a dying industry town, Cleveland. It was a very industrial, auto town sort of thing that wasn't sexy, but it was a fantastic place to have a year as a high school student. With work, after Stanford, when I got involved in mining and explosives here, I went back with an opportunity to Salt Lake for a few years, and then Connecticut for a few years, working for a Norwegian company of all things, but based in the US. And again, look, I like the US. I love it. I cannot understand the success of the US, because when you meet Americans in a business context and stuff like that, everybody's relatively, I liken it to vanilla plain. But something happens in terms of the US economy and how people get driven, and it works. I've really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the time I've had in the US, but I do like Australia, Michael. You can have New York for so long, then you've got to come back to Sydney or somewhere over this part of the world.
I came here 35 years ago and went from here to Stanford and back, and I'll never look back. But if you haven't experienced New York, you got to go. But Russell, what's interesting is one of the things you wrote is all this AI stuff. We still need companies that actually manufacture. We're still hoping we're going to keep on some of that manufacturing in Australia, but also do the heavy lifting, so to speak, over your career. Even starting, it's interesting that you started at Air New Zealand, but we can't do AI yet to zoom ourselves over there or mine or do that kind of stuff. So I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, we were chatting a little bit beforehand in terms of, I'm not sure I even joined the internet age, Michael, to be quite honest, because I've always been in old industries, little alone the information age. I'm not a big data person. I always hired another classmate of ours whenever I needed data problems.
John.
I went and got
John McNamara, you better be listening.
But you know, I look at my kids in terms of what they're looking at and going into the business and into the world, and there's still an opportunity for. One of my frustrations here in Australia is that everybody seems to have to go to university. You've got to go to university, you've got to have a university degree. But there are lots of roles, especially in the social area, nursing, education,
Yeah, big time.
where people come out of university with a hell of a lot of debt in Australia and into relatively low paying jobs. And my view is, there used to be alternate pathways to gaining that experience and getting a good professional career without going to university. Nursing's a prime example in terms of, they used to train in hospitals, they used to get paid to train. Now, and I'm not 100% certain, but pretty much you have to go to university. You'll come out with $40,000 or $50,000 worth of university debt, and going into a socially responsible, caring role, relatively low paid, with a burden. And as I get older, I get more concerned about our willingness as a group and a social group to fund those social necessities of education, health, welfare, that type of thing as a society. And that's my age coming through. I would not have had this discussion when I was 35 coming out of Stanford. There's no two ways about it.
Well, in some ways, Russell, it'll be interesting to talk to Michael. For one thing, our Australian universities are considerably less expensive than the US ones. But do you see, Michael, the Stanford? I always thought it as a ticket, ticket to re-enter, enter, re-enter. But choosing from Australia to go to a very expensive university, what's the tuition now, Michael?
I think the tuition itself is around $160,000, not including board and travel and other incidentals.
So that's a big investment.
Big investment. And
Yeah.
I was just thinking that, like, I do see where you're coming from, Russell, but at the same time, it's still a university in Australia is still a lot less expensive than the US, and there's kind of HEX, so you can take out a non-interest loan from the Australian government, and so it does make things a little easier. I would say, Catherine, it's a really good point. I think that's also an inhibitor to international students, especially for countries where the exchange rate is not doing so well. And so, I mean, a lot of my savings were in AUD, and so coming here, everything just becomes extremely expensive. And also,
Sure.
it's a little harder to get loans as an international student. So, my student loans were at a higher interest rate, and it was also an interesting time where the interest rates were really high. So that was a consideration. I would say you kind of have to spend some time convincing yourself that the benefits will outweigh the costs. And I see it as an investment in kind of myself and my career, and the ticket to kind of, at the same time, that's also why I want to stay in the US, is you will be earning US dollars. And so that kind of helps to, pay off the debts. But it's definitely a really big financial decision. And I think for some people, there is a bit of inhibition with regards to the huge amount of money it costs.
So okay, so you know where you're going, Michael. You're going to New York. It sounds like you have a job, and curiosity is for your classmates. How many are going into the venture capital equity world? Is it big time for us? We had a small percentage, Russell, the people that had the adventurous spirit to go into venture capital and Sand Hill Road, pretty much. But a lot of us went to consulting and investment banking and back into corporate. So what do you see, Michael, in terms of your classmates?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So coming in, about 20% of the class comes from an investment
Yep.
professional kind of background,
Yep.
so VC
Check.
of private equity, and then we have a lot of consultants and some bankers.
Yep.
We don't know for our class what that looks like yet. So I think a lot of people are still recruiting and looking for jobs. But I think typically what we see is, people follow whatever's kind of hot or trendy. MBA jobs follow whatever's hot or trendy. And so a couple of years ago it was crypto. Like right now it's kind of AI. Everyone wants to be a part of that. I think before, in the late 90s, it would have been tech. And so it's interesting to see. I think there's a lot of interest in startups and venture capital and trying to do something with an AI adjacency. There's a lot of interest in product management, which is kind of a blend of the business and technical side. And so I will get back to you on how many people go into kind of private equity and venture capital, I would say one thing that has changed is I think there's less people going into consulting and investment banking now.
Yes.
I would say it's definitely less than what.
That's what I understand, which is interesting to hear. I was talking to a friend of mine that used to be a partner at one of our big consulting firms, and she was saying, wow, we're just not getting a lot of the talent that we'd like to. So what's interesting for us, Russell, is in our country, well, you comment, I mean, you're the expert, but in our country, over our tenure, we've lost a lot of the manufacturing base in Australia. We are an economy, well, you know this, Michael, but I'm always fascinated. You know, we're called the lucky country. And I'm always fascinated by how much reliance we have on the mining sector, which Russell would know. And we continue to do so. And my guess is we're going to continue to do so. And we keep thinking, when's it going to run out? And I'm curious, Russell, how you've seen the manufacturing sector in Australia, the mining sector. What do you think our country's going to continue to do?
My sense is there'll be less of it. Sorry, there'll be less employment in it because AI will have a huge impact on, factory jobs and production, not simple production, but process production. I think AI will take over all of that, whether it's mining, whether it's food manufacturing. I don't think the population base is going to be necessary to support that activity at the same level that it's got now, or even if it grows, just because jobs will be lost to, robotics and AI. The problem I have is I have one of my businesses one of the business I'm responsible for is a small joinery manufacturing business in Tasmania. That's the hardest thing in the world to get good, capable people. And, we offer apprenticeships, we offer trade training, we offer as much as we can to try and get people interested out of school because it's a necessary skill. We have to have people to do those roles, jobbing type roles. And it's very hard to get. It's okay to get people. It's very hard to get the people you want to be in the business with the right attitude and the right skill set. And that's, I think, the challenge going forward. Because if our high schools and universities aren't focused on having some strong operational courses and training, where are those skills going to come from? And they will be necessary. Maybe not in the same volume that we have today. And I don't read enough about it, but my sense is, places like India and China do seem to have, and as I say, I don't know, they do seem to have a focus on making sure that they have engineers and technologists and people able to turn their hand to that type of thing. Whereas here in Australia and the US, my sense is that we're a much stronger service orientation,
definitely,
or purely intellectual technical sort of endeavors. And I don't know where the balance is going to come because the old economy still drives a lot of things. I mean, you need farmers. There's no two ways about it. Now, that'll be an area where there's even less employment going forward because of the automation, but you still need people on the land to feed everybody in the city sort of things.
It's really interesting. And Michael, when you see yourself going to New York and you say public equity, what do you think you guys will be, I don't have the word for, let's say investing in and then getting out? What are the sexy industries you think that you'll be acting?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's kind of different buckets of industry coverage. So everyone will be assigned to a different coverage. I spent the summer covering technology and tech, which is where a lot of gains have come, I would say. But it's interesting if I think to Australia, in Australian public markets, it's actually primarily the banks and the miners.
Yeah.
And so those are the biggest companies that drive kind of a lot of the public market trading volume. And so it's just a very kind of different scale. Like you don't have the huge M7 tech companies that are kind of making up a huge part of the index. And so it's a very different kind of equity investment landscape. And so my answer to what I'll be investing is probably tech and looking at kind of, we talk about like AI adjacencies or things that'll benefit from the shift in AI. And so it's things like data centers, it's things like workflow automation, anything that can try and make these kind of AI processes more efficient. It's semiconductors and semiconductor adjacencies. So we talk a lot about kind of people that are selling the picks and shovels. Maybe a certain part of the value chain that could be valuable. And so that's kind of what I think a lot of US equity is really excited about. If I spoke to a counterpart in the Australian office, they would probably say something different, just by virtue of the different nature.
Well, Russell and I can do that because we studied supply chain, and Russell went on to study supply chain operations. We just don't know how to add AI yet. I don't know, Russell. What do you think?
I don't know. I still remember The Goal. Did you
Yes.
get the book, The Goal? I give it to all of my operating managers as something to read, and some of them actually read it. But
is that the theory of constraints and the buffers?
Yeah. Written as a novel. It's a very light read,
That's right.
But you get most of the theory through it, and it is a very light read. But it's I don't know where it's going to end up. I honestly don't know where it's going to end up, because the power of AI and the ability to sift through so many conflicting bits of information and find a kernel of, I hope, truth amongst it is so much greater than my capacity to think through these things. So at the end of the day, as managers in an operating business, what value do we bring, for an operating manager running a production line or things like that? If AI can actually review hundreds of thousands of data points and then distill that to here's an issue or here's not an issue, what do I bring other than maybe managing people, which is always going to be a part of the equation. But my manufacturing supervisor, I could see it at some point being a laptop, because optimizing, all the stuff we did when we were consultants, all of that can be done. The data manipulation will happen, and then all of the output will be much as what we did, but just so much faster, so much quicker, and having dealt with so many more inputs than we could comprehend.
And I was doing the inventory turns on A, B, and C's.
Yeah.
Anyway, have we still got you, Michael? You're still there? Yeah, there you are.
Yeah.
Michael, who are your customers? Like, what's your clients? What are you acting for?
Yeah, so it's a lot of 401k money. So we've got kind of retirement funds, and then we have people that aggregate kind of those funds. So we've got kind of pension plans, endowments. And so primarily those are kind of the people but it's mainly institutional money. So it's not kind of individual. Actually, that's not true. There are a couple of individual client accounts. So think of like a Fidelity, a Capital Group, a T. Rowe Price. So that's kind of who, that's when you kind of have 401k, that's kind of where the kind of the managers of that.
And who do you compete against? Who are your main competitors?
So primarily other mutual funds. Funds like the names I just mentioned. Also, more and more so, there's a rise of passive investing. So I'm talking about active stock picking, but passive is getting a lot bigger because, it is really hard to be an active stock picker. And so companies like Vanguard and BlackRock, which are doing a lot of ETFs and passive ETFs, they're attracting a lot of inflows. So we compete with passive as well.
I still remember Kath, our finance lecturer. Who was the guy who did the Nobel Prize in the Black-Scholes?
Oh, yeah. What was
William Scholes?
Yeah. Bill Scholes.
No, it was, but anyway,
another one.
First day of class, we walk into class, everybody takes their seat looking forward to this amazing guy who's going to teach us stuff. He walks in very nondescript and writes 8 numbers up on the board. And it doesn't say anything, and he turns around and starts talking to the class. And then I can't remember who it was. It might have been Volcker or somebody like that. Put their hand up at the back and go, excuse me, because he wrote it up and everybody dutifully wrote it down in their notebooks because there weren't too many people with laptops. Everybody dutifully wrote it down. And then someone at the back, after a little while, goes, excuse me, but what was the number? He said, look, if you take nothing away from this course, nothing, because he was teaching portfolio theory and all these things, nothing away from this course, remember that number. So then the 50% of the class who didn't write it down obviously didn't write it down. And I said, well, what is it? And he says, it's the number, I think it was for Vanguard funds. He said, it's a low cost fund, buys the market, and you'll never lose. It's the best advice you can get in this class. So, your passive investment was... that's exactly it.
Absolutely. You'd be surprised at the number of hedge funds that can't outperform a passive index.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
But Michael, so what's your edge then? You guys are active pickers. So what's your edge? How can you outperform these
Yeah.
guys?
Yeah. So we engage in something called fundamental equity analysis, which means just like analyzing the fundamentals of a company. And so
Okay.
that comes by spending a lot of time and having really good management access. And so there's different things we can do, but it's essentially doing deep research into a stock, speaking to management, talking to them and understanding what's mispriced about the stock. So, everyone's process is different, but for me, it means talking to everyone. So, customers, suppliers, employees, ex employees, management, and competitors. And so, understanding the mosaic of what's happening in the company, whether things are getting better or worse, and where expectations are. So, I think something that people don't appreciate about public markets is it's often about where expectations are, not if it's a good or a bad company. So a good company could be a bad stock, and a
That's right.
good stock could be you could make money in a bad company. What matters is where people's expecting the stock to go,
Absolutely.
and whether or not there's any dislocation in those
That's it.
expectations. And so what happens with Nvidia is they beat expectations, they make a ton of money, but the stock still doesn't go up. It's because people were expecting them to hit it even more out of the park than they did. And
Yep.
so it's a great company, but it hasn't been a great stock.
So that's,
Michael, sorry,
yeah,
Kath.
go, Russell.
Michael, you said something in terms of access to management, for this analysis. If you found what you think is a great stock or a great investment, but don't get access to management, how heavily does that weigh on your decision making?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's very important. People weigh it differently, but I think it's incredibly important because you want to know how the people that are running the company are thinking, what their strategic priorities are, and you through a lot of reps and touch points with these managers, you kind of get a sense for how they're speaking and what their kind of overall pulse on the company is. And so it's incredibly important. And also that's the benefit of working for one of these large mutual funds is because you have so many assets under management. So $1, 2, 3 trillion of assets. And so these companies are very willing to speak to you. So they're in terms of management access, they will sit down with you and be willing to share, an hour or 2 hours of their time and explain exactly what they're working on. Whereas with the hedge funds, which typically are, I would say, a little bit more aggressive, sometimes they trade on the quarter and then so they take positions quickly, but also exit positions quickly. They are probably a little less willing to talk to you. And so your management access would look like, 10 hedge funds around a table. You have 1 hour and you probably get one question in. Whereas with a mutual fund, you're spending a lot of time with them. You have a relationship with them. They're telling you a lot more. And so that really gives you an edge because you've just got better access and you know more about what's going on.
One of the things I wanted to do, I'm a career like I've analyzed cultures and leadership and everything else, and I've continued to go to the venture capital and private equity world and say, you need this skill. You have no idea. I can tell you what you've got in terms of talent. Now, when you're turning it over fast and you're getting rid of management quickly, then you don't care, Michael. But is that what you care about? How good the leadership is, how solid the culture is?
100%. And that is one of the biggest takeaways from the GSB as well. We have a lot of classes here. One of the most famous is called Managing Growing Enterprises. And the key message in that class is that A's hire A's. And the number one most important thing is to hire good talent. A good way to reframe and redefine a lot of things is to think about every business as a talent business, right? Talent matters in every single organization. And so even as an investor, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for people that can motivate employees, that can kind of support people and train people and lead them to do their best work. And so that's also what we're kind of testing for. And so there's people have reputations. We know that certain companies have incredible management, and that's a really big impact.
I am so glad to hear that. That's been my career. I've actually relabeled myself talent agent. But Russell, you've lived in leadership and you know good people. And you have to bring John McNamara in because you don't have the so, what have you learned over the years about the importance of people? Talent.
Okay, the smartest guy in the room concept is a death to good management. Michael, I am not the smartest guy in any room that I participate in. But what I have learned is that, and fundamentally, I'm quite lazy, which is not a bad thing for management because I try to find the easiest way to do things.
Yeah.
And if the easiest way to do things is hiring somebody better than me at doing it, That's what you've got to do. My worst business experiences have been with people or people reporting to me or people above me who don't like hiring people better than them. And I've just, my whole career, post Stanford, has been making sure I've got people better than me working in the organization, because it challenges me, but it also makes my job a hell of a lot easier, to be quite honest. It just gives you answers that you can't come up with yourself. That's the thing.
Got it. It would, and Michael, the experience you have, it's interesting. Might I ask your age? Are you that hovering around 30-ish?
I'm turning 30 this year. Yeah.
See, yeah. So it's interesting when you are that age, having remembered that a little bit, I loved working with talent. I loved working that. But I wonder, is the 30 age now with what companies you're going to be looking for? What's the challenges do you think you're going to have? You would have gotten some wide perspectives from being in Hong Kong and Australia. What do you think you're going to be challenged by in New York?
Yeah. I think I liked private equity because I got a lot of exposure at a very young age to a lot of boardrooms and very senior people. But at the same time, you can't help but wonder, you know, I look a little younger, and people will kind of question, well, what's your experience? And there's kind of a question mark put around the comments you made. And so I think, going into 30 this year and actually coming to the GSB has just made me a lot more confident. I think Silicon Valley in general is just, there's a lot of young people doing a lot of ambitious things. And so people here kind of value what you have to say rather than what you look like. And I think that's also an idiosyncrasy of the US and Silicon Valley. It's like it's all about the content and what you're willing to build rather than what you look like. And you see that every day on campus. You've got undergrads raising a ton of money. They're like raising all this capital to change the world and have all these interesting things. And so for me, what'll be challenging New York, I think still like coming to terms with understanding the US and trying to understand the landscape here. I think we have a really interesting political environment. We have a really interesting difference in culture. Like New York and California obviously are two mini countries, but then you've got the whole Middle America, which is very different. And so trying to learn more about how to connect with people, because this is not a homogenous country by any means. It's so different. So trying to get to terms with that, I think that's something that will be challenging.
It'll be interesting, Russell, because one of the things I know in growing older, we're all hovering around 60s or whatever, some older, some younger, but one of the things I've noticed about it is I look at you and I go, yeah, we're about the same age. This guy is like I could talk to him just across the board table, and and I don't think you guys see that. But Russell, I don't know if you experienced that. I had a big age chip when I was coming out of business school. So if I was working with 60s, I would very much defer to their judgment and be quite somewhat intimidated. I don't know. So the age is interesting. The age kind of collapses as you get older. What do you think, Russell?
I think it's both the age, but I think also people are much more accepting of youth and talent now than what they were when we were. When I first started in New Zealand, you weren't allowed to be a manager under 40. Didn't matter how good you were in the engineering group. No one was hired as a manager or put in a manager role under 40. And no matter how good you were. And that was that was part of the culture of the business and business at the time. I think now, where people see things moving so quickly, it doesn't matter who you are, it's the value of your ideas. And I think that flavors my thinking coming from Stanford, because it was my first, when I going through engineering, there's a lot of rote learning. There's a lot of, here's how we do it. Here's how you approach it, blah, 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 logical thinking, all that sort of stuff. At Stanford, it was the first real time where you had to think and support your ideas in the classroom. And hopefully I've taken that across the rest of my career. I'm not the smartest guy in the room. Any idea is a good idea, and you can't think while you're talking. You think while you're listening. It's, those sort of things make a difference going forward, I think.
That's right. Michael, it's going to be interesting for you to pick, because we're just going into the unknown. Now, let me remind you, I was in an investment class with Professor Van Horn, my favorite I was actually doing fine. I love finance, but we actually had the opportunity to have Warren Buffett. I can't believe Warren Buffett is still Warren Buffett 30 years later. Oh my God. Anyway, we had the opportunity. He was still lauded. He was, and we had the opportunity for him to come. And we said in 1994, whatever it was, 95, who are you most interested in? And we were all kind of excited about this emerging, we called it Mosaic. It was a web crawler that eventually became Netscape. Netscape went public in 1995. It was the first public listed browser. But anyway, we asked him, what would you invest in? And he said, I wouldn't invest in that technology. It's hard, steel capped boots. You need to be able to understand the product, touch that. But now, Michael, we're going into not even the information age and data and big data, the internet, but we're going into this really weird world. Like, is that the stuff that you're going to be looking at for ideas? How do you even conceptualize a good idea out of that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We had Lisa Su, who's the CEO of AMD, on campus last week, and she was speaking about how AI is probably the most transformative technology she's seen in her career. And I honestly, even in the past year, I see it in our day-to-day lives. Like, we have ChatGPT now that people are using in the classroom. It can generate an entire essay for you
And
within
you guys can use it,
seconds.
right? You're allowed to use
We
it.
can.
Yeah.
There's a policy. There's an official policy. It depends on the professor, but typically you can use it to assist and help with generating ideas. But you have to have a final review of it, and you have to make sure that it's like your wording. But you can use it to help you. For me, like, it is exciting. It feels like, I was born in 95, and that was the cusp of the internet age, and now kind of
Absolutely.
graduating, and it's the cusp of the AI revolution. And I think, looking for ideas, it's, where can there be processes that are streamlined or made better? And where are people's lives changing? I think that's always really important when looking at kind of consumer investing, is like, which kind of parts of people's lives are having less friction, and where are people willingly spending their time, and where is the value being added? So I think, yeah, I was skeptical of ChatGPT in the beginning, and now it's just become, the latest version has just become so proliferated on campus that it's incredible, and the speed at which it's changing is just crazy. So I can't wait to see what happens.
Well, my partner thinks I have another partner because it's with me all day long. I'm serious. I love it. I mean, I just like
you can chat with it.
Yeah, well, I do. My God, it's fantastic. The idea. What's interesting, Michael, is the ideas generation that it allows me to do without the stuff like doing. For example, I do a lot of CEO succession, and so I say, okay, tell me the really good cases, business cases of CEO succession, and the really bad cases all over the world. Now tell me about Australia. Now tell me about Hong Kong. It's amazing. So go back to what you said, the consumer, what makes their life have less friction. Give us an example of something really cool that maybe one of your colleagues do, or what you're seeing. How are you going to make our life easier? Or what the
Yeah, well,
companies?
yeah, I mean, there's kind of a ton of things, but one thing that I can think of is just changes in how people work. So, I mean, Zoom is a huge example that is reducing kind of travel times, and, there's differences in people's views about how long you should be in the office. But essentially, if you believe that, people are wasting time, driving to work, then you're in theory meant to have more kind of time that you can work. And then there's also companies that, things that are doing virtual mailboxes, right? It's no longer necessary to have a physical address anymore. You don't need to have a mail room. It's all kind of a lot more efficient. And so I would say that's where the friction is being reduced. And so that's where I like to spend my time. It's kind of on ideas that are making my life easier and letting me spend more time on things that matter. And yeah, I think Zoom is a good example. I think there's kind of, I was looking at like travel aggregator the other day that kind of would plan out my entire itinerary. So I'm no longer spending time kind of trying to manage across time zones. And also there's kind of virtual EAs now. So, they will respond to your emails as if they're a real person, and they'll schedule everything for you. So all those things are really exciting.
Back in the days, Russell, I don't know. I actually, for me, this internet age made things crazy. More and more time. I mean, when I worked before Stanford, we had to leave. After, 6, there were no computers. Like, we don't bring a huge computer home, and it's not like we could connect to any internet. What's your experience over 30 years, Russell, with technology and the way it is affected our lives?
It's insidious,
This is
and
great
it
word.
takes over without really notice. Sorry, takes over is the wrong word. It gets involved without really a conscious decision on our part. We find a technology that's great. To Michael's point, I'm going to Europe later this year with my partner, and I want to go for a nice restaurant. So I had two options. I ring Francois Josseron, one of our classmates who lives in Paris, and another French chap I know here in Sydney, and they give me four restaurants. And I go on Chat GPT and I go, I'm staying at this hotel. I need four, Michelin star restaurants within a 5-minute walk. Done. It got 4 out of the 5 of the same recommendations that my friends gave me. Now, that's great. But what I worry about is, will it mean that I don't talk to my friends? Because that human interaction,
Yeah.
some of our daily lives and interaction with people is just mundane crap, that you just go through, but it causes the interaction. Whereas AI, I'm going to use Chat GPT for my next holiday because it'll just do it for me and it'll be done quickly and it's done like that. But I'll miss that. I won't call Francois. I won't call, some of my friends from Stanford and parts of the world because I did it on Chat GPT. And that's a little bit what I worry about, that how insidious it can get to having your EA on your phone or having your best friend as Chat GPT. That's not a conversation with the real world.
You're so right, Russell. One of the arguments I'm writing about is, are we heading into sort of in an integration where ChatGPT can do all this, or isolation where we're by ourselves? Michael, what do you guys think at Stanford? Are you worried about the culture that's emerging that be leading, especially given some of the political aspects, socioeconomic, all that stuff that is interesting, I should say. I mean, I'm watching US news. I think the whole world's watching US news. I'm addicted to it. So, what does your class worry about or get challenged by, how you're going to have to lead this world emerging? That's a huge question.
That is a big question. That is a big question. I love it. I don't think we're the best group of people to ask about
Interesting. Yeah.
concerns about technology because we're just in the thick of it. And there's a lot of Kool-Aid drinking, I have to be honest, right? Like,
Yes.
people are raising a ton of money and everyone's super bullish on AI. Sometimes it does feel like a little bit of a bubble. And I think it's important to have other perspectives that question the ethical and the lifestyle impacts that technology will have. So I absolutely agree with you on that. I think, to be honest, if I think about what our class is worried about, it's kind of two things. One is finding a job, and as is with every single MBA student,
Absolutely.
finding a job.
Yep.
And then more, more on a macro perspective, just like the political environment that we're entering into, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. At the same time, there's an administration that's doing a lot of things and having a lot of changes. And so there's really very tangible and real impacts that will happen. I think a lot of international students are worried about their visas. I think a lot of people are worried that their kind of industries will be affected by the tariffs. Yeah. And so I think that's kind of the bigger worries. I think the technology side of things, most people are very, very bought in, just by virtue of the fact that we're Stanford. So,
well, Michael, it's interesting because Russell, we found out the same, and that was what Buffett was all about. I mean, sure, he's got technology all over his stuff, but at that point, between 95 and 2000, when the bubble burst, we had exactly the same thing, because none of us knew, we could go internet. Oh, great. We'll throw some money at you. Great, great. And so that's what happened. And so it'd be interesting, Russell, do you remember that time between 95 and 2000?
Everybody talked about one of the most important KPIs in a startup was the burn rate.
Yes, yes, yes.
How quickly are you using your money? Don't worry about revenue, income, or profit. How quickly are you using the money that people are providing you? And it was all about, getting ahead of the curve, or at least getting up to the curve and on the curve. And the only way people saw it as being able to do that was by spending, expanding the business, growing the business with no recompense to profitability or just the business fundamentals that you loved in your finance course, Kath.
I did.
But so look, yeah, I don't know. The internet was a fantastic thing, and I loved it when I was at Stanford. I had to laugh when I was listening to one of the odd podcasts, and you mentioned the pigeonholes. And I think that was how we communicated across the.
Michael, there were little boxes that we each had across the wall, and to do what you did, a blast, we had to literally put paper in every single.
Honestly, I think we should reintroduce those. It might be fun.
No, don't. No, there are some advantages to the internet age.
Yeah.
But the thing, I loved it. I loved the whole idea of freedom of information and getting to that. But I only had one concern, and this is coming from a technical background, which was peer review is a great arbiter of value in terms of ideas. It's also conservative, and it also maintains status quo in a lot of cases. Worries me, and I've got a question for you, Michael. At the end of this, is there is no peer review on the internet. There is no sort of recognized validity to the ideas that are out there. And I think we see that in terms of some of the stuff that's out on the net today. And my question for you is, where do Stanford students go for the truth? Because I look at my old sources of information and news about the world, and I struggle to believe any of them because I just struggle to believe it. So where do we go for the truth when we want to make considered decisions about things that affect us and our families and the world in that regard?
That is a really good question. And I think it's definitely something people talk about on campus. I think, there's a lot of misinformation out there and there's a lot of kind of fake news. And it's disappointing that even with AI, that there can be even more fake news. So things like deep fakes are really concerning as well. So it's interesting. Where I think people go for the truth is also where there's the most misinformation, and that's Twitter. Now it's X.
Yes.
It's just the feedback loop is a lot quicker and it's unfiltered. At the same time, there's a lot of misinformation out there, but sometimes it can be the fastest kind of indicator of what is really happening. And then you try and verify it with other kind of more reputable sources. Try and look at kind of different types and sources of media that are not kind of just on either end of the political spectrum, international media as well. But it is hard. It's definitely a concern, I think, even for me, like as I think about my future, when I have children, like the world that they're coming into, like where is the absolute truth anymore, right? It's hard to sift through that. And so, yeah, I think that's a really loaded question. I don't know if there is one kind of right answer.
Well, that's what the social world is dealing with. And I'm so glad to hear that Stanford's allowing you to use ChatGPT, because it really puts the onus on you guys to sort it out, sift it out. And I'm fascinated by that. What is your absolute favorite part of your week? Easy question, right?
So I'm not retired, but I'm considering it and I'm winding down, all those sorts of things. My favorite part of the week is anytime I come home. Anytime I'm with family and friends, that's my favorite part of the week. And I wouldn't say that previously, because lots of time you're driven by different things as you go through your career, and you meet fantastic people in a business context, and that was amazing. But now it's family and friends are much more important to me in terms of the scheme of things across my life, and so that's always a good thing. So that's it. That's my favorite part.
And it's interesting how it shifts. A question for you, Michael, and wrapping it up is, how can our generation help you and help your generation?
I think our generation is, digital native, really ambitious, wants to change the world. I think, responding to requests for advice or help, and kind of passing on the kind of knowledge, because it's a really interesting time. Like everyone has grown up with or seen the rise of technology. And so I think sharing lessons about, what things were like during the tech bubble, trying to kind of mitigate these risks and these things happening again, and kind of just lifting up kind of people that are really ambitious could be really helpful.
Well, thank you. I'm glad we still have some use. Thank you, Russell and Michael. I really appreciate that conversation. Thank you for joining us. For more insights and information, visit my website at katherinemclennan.com. That's spelled KATHARINEMCLENNAN.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the series so you know when the next episode will be as we continue exchanging wisdom, connecting past, present, and future through the perspectives of Stanford MBA graduates of 1995 and 2025.